What if I told you that Viking crews, dozens of men crammed shoulder to shoulder on open boats, drenched in salt, robbed of privacy, battered by Arctic wind, with no toilets, no fresh drinking water, and no protection from the brutal North Atlantic, should have died long before they ever saw another shore? What if I told you that, by every biological rule we know, their ships should have turned into drifting disease traps? The same kind of floating disasters that wiped out entire European fleets centuries later. And here's the part that stops historians in their tracks. They didn't collapse. They thrived. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did Viking voyages avoid the sanitation catastrophes that crippled almost every other navy in human history? For more than 100 years, archaeologists have combed through ship burials. Oseberg, Gokstad, Thun, Ladby finding wood, textiles, tools, sleds, wagons, even fragile plant fibers preserved against all odds. But one thing has never appeared: a sanitation system. No latrine, no partition, no waste barrel, no hidden chamber, nothing at all. That silence is the first thread of a mystery stretching across ocean, biology, and craftsmanship. A thread that tightens as we move deeper. And by the end of this journey, a single detail hidden inside the planks of the Longship will close the loop in a way no one expects. Hold that thought, because this story begins in a place far more hostile than any battlefield on land. The North Atlantic wasn't an adventure highway. It was a grinder, an endless, merciless arena where storms didn't arrive, they erupted. A place where walls of water rose high enough to blot out the horizon, and where cold didn't merely bite, but carved straight into bone. Medieval chroniclers described its winter seas as iron, stiff and hostile as forged metal. Modern sailors armed with GPS, steel hulls, and weather satellites still call these waters unforgiving, a region where mistakes are punished instantly. And yet, this was the arena the Vikings chose not just to enter, but to master. While other civilizations built towering cargo ships with deep holds, decks, and layers of protection, the Vikings embraced the opposite philosophy. They created a narrow, open, flexible blade of wood, long, low, and fast, designed not to resist chaos, but to slice through it. No enclosed compartments. No private sleeping rooms. Barely a few inches of freeboard separating men from icy waves. Just open wind, raw exposure, and the constant shudder of the sea beneath them. Dozens of men lived in that space. Salt crusted their skin. Freezing mist filled their lungs. Their wool clothing stayed wet for days, sometimes weeks. By any logical standard, outbreaks should have been unavoidable. Food should have spoiled in the damp. Moisture should have fed mold and rot. Parasites should have spread through the crew like wildfire. And yet, they survived. More than survived, they crossed from Norway to Iceland, to Greenland, even to North America, enduring distances that should have broken them. To understand why, we must first understand what archaeologists expected to find aboard these ships, and why the complete absence of that evidence speaks louder than any artifact ever could. The ship graves of Scandinavia are among the most astonishing archaeological time capsules in all of Europe. In Oseberg, the earth preserved tapestries woven with impossible detail. Carved sleighs etched with spirals and beasts. Animal bones arranged with ritual precision. Woolen textiles still clinging to their original dyes, even fragments of spices carried from distant markets. In Gokstad, archaeologists uncovered shields, beds, leather shoes, wooden buckets, cooking gear, and tools that seemed almost waiting to be used again. These ships should have surrendered everything to time, and yet so much survived. Everything, except one thing. No sanitation tools, no carved latrine, no designated waste corner, no special barrel, no reinforced planking for a toilet area, not even soil discoloration in places where waste might have pooled. Nothing. And it isn't because these items decayed. Far more fragile objects: wool, feathers, woven baskets, even plant fibers, survived 1,000 Scandinavian winters. If sanitation systems had existed, something would remain. A stain, a shape, a pattern in the planks. But the silence is total. And that silence isn't neutral. It's intentional. It points to a truth hidden not in missing artifacts, but in the ship itself, a truth so simple it went unnoticed for decades. Yet so profound it reshapes how historians understand Viking survival at sea. Before we can unlock that truth, we need to step into the daily lives of the warriors who treated hygiene not as comfort, but as strategy long before they ever stepped onto a longship. In most of medieval Europe, bathing was a rare ritual, something done once a year, maybe twice, often postponed until the smell became unbearable. Chroniclers described villages where people went months without washing. Monasteries and garrisons fell to waves of illness that spread faster than any sword. But the Vikings broke that rule entirely. They treated cleanliness not as comfort, but as discipline. They washed weekly. They combed their hair and braided their beards every morning. They carried grooming kits, tweezers, razors, combs, even small ear spoons with the same consistency others carried weapons. To them, hygiene wasn't vanity. It was a form of cultural warfare, a quiet, strategic shield against the parasites and infections that crippled medieval populations. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, observing them in 921 CE along the Volga River, was stunned by what he saw. Warriors who fought with brutal ferocity, yet groomed themselves with almost ritual precision. English chroniclers complained that Vikings were too well kept, arguing their tidy appearance made them dangerously attractive to local women. Cleanliness, in other words, became a psychological advantage, an unexpected edge. But beneath that, it was something far more practical. A biological defense against lice, infection, and the slow, creeping rot that destroyed armies long before they reached any battlefield. And here's the contradiction that deepens the mystery. This culture of hygiene evaporated the moment they stepped onto a ship. At sea, there were no baths, no basins, no fresh water to spare. Just wind, salt, sweat, and exposure, an environment where cleanliness should have collapsed instantly. Yet somehow, Viking crews didn't fall to outbreaks. They didn't suffer the epidemics that ravaged other naval forces. So the true answer must lie deeper, somewhere far more subtle than grooming, somewhere woven directly into how they lived, moved, and survived on the open sea. When nature called, the Vikings chose the simplest solution imaginable. They moved to the ship's edge and relieved themselves directly into the sea. Immediate disposal. No barrels to store waste. No pits to ferment it. No dark corners where bacteria could gather strength. Crude? Absolutely. Efficient? Surprisingly so. But simplicity alone cannot explain their survival. Because this method only works under one specific condition. The ship itself must never allow waste to linger. Not in corners. Not beneath planks. Not soaked into wood. Not pooling in hidden spaces the crew couldn't reach. If even small amounts of moisture or organic material collected in the wrong place, the longship would have become a breeding ground warm enough, damp enough, and filthy enough for disease to take root. But that never happened. And this is where Viking naval engineering becomes stunningly, almost counterintuitively advanced, not because of complex technology, but because of intentional, radical simplicity. Unlike the layered, enclosed vessels of medieval Europe, the Viking longship was never meant to function as a closed world. It didn't trap heat. It didn't hold humidity. It didn't lock filth beneath a deck. Instead, it behaved like something alive. Wind moved freely across every inch of space. Saltwater washed the floorboards with every rising wave. Sun and cold air dried the planks faster than bacteria could take hold. The longship wasn't just a vehicle. It was a breathing organism, flexing, draining, cleansing with each motion of the sea. And in that fluid, open design lies the first deeper clue to how Viking crews avoided the sanitation disasters that destroyed so many navies that came after them. Viking longships were built using the clinker method, overlapping planks, riveted together with iron nails, forming a living, flexible shell that moved with the sea instead of fighting against it. Each board was sealed with wool, tar, or animal hair, but never so tightly that the hull became rigid. Minute gaps always remained. To a modern shipbuilder, those gaps look like a design flaw, an invitation for leaks. But to the Vikings, whether they realized it or not, those gaps became an accidental miracle. Every rising wave pushed thin sheets of seawater through the lower planks. Not enough to sink the ship, but just enough to wash across the bilge lifting sand, bits of food, spilled animal fat, stray debris, and any organic waste that might have settled there. And then, just as naturally, the crew bailed the water back out. A constant rhythm, a rinse, a purge, over and over, day and night. Water flowed in. Water flowed out. Nothing lingered long enough to rot. Nothing remained still long enough to grow dangerous. What emerged was a self-cleaning ecosystem. One nature ran for them. No dark hidden chambers. No standing pools where disease thrives. No trapped pockets of heat. No stale, stagnant air. No corners for bacteria to colonize. In a world before microscopes, before germ theory, before sanitation science, the Vikings had built a ship that behaved like it already understood all of it. The sea itself became their sanitation engine, flushing the vessel every hour, scrubbing away the very waste that would have doomed other crews. But the Longship's brilliance didn't stop at waste. It also solved another lethal problem that plagued sailors for centuries: how to drink safely without carrying fresh water at all. Most medieval fleets carried fresh water in wooden barrels. But fresh water has a fatal flaw. It dies. Within days, it turns foul, clouded with algae, swarming with bacteria, thick with the taste of decay. Sailors across history suffered for it, falling to dysentery, dehydration, and the slow collapse of morale. But the Vikings sidestepped this millennia-old vulnerability with a solution so simple it feels revolutionary. They didn't drink water at all. Instead, they relied entirely on liquids that could defend themselves. They drank weak beer light, low in alcohol, but acidic enough to stay safe. They carried sour milk, its sharpness preserved by natural fermentation. They made fermented whey, a nutrient-rich drink with an acidity hostile to pathogens. And they diluted mead to create daily beverages that resisted spoilage. These weren't luxuries. These were biochemical tools, living liquids filled with microcultures that outcompeted harmful bacteria long before humanity understood microbes even existed. Even a beer with only 2% alcohol remained stable for weeks, far outlasting any barrel of fresh water. The Vikings didn't need purity. They needed resilience. They chose drinks that fought for their own survival. This wasn't guesswork. It was inherited knowledge, refined through generations who understood intuitively that still water kills. So instead of carrying a vulnerable resource, they carried a biological shield. But hydration was only one side of the story. Sanitation wasn't determined solely by what happened aboard the ship. Another hidden rhythm shaped Viking survival, one written not on the waves, but along the coastlines they touched again and again. And to understand that rhythm, we must follow them back to shore. Viking voyages were never endless, uninterrupted pushes across the open ocean. They were a chain of controlled bursts hugging coastlines, slipping between islands, resting where land allowed. These stops weren't leisurely pauses. They were survival resets written into the very rhythm of the journey. Every few days, crews would beach the Longship or pull it onto a narrow strip of shore. And once there, a quiet choreography unfolded. Clothing was peeled off and laid out to dry in the sun and wind. Wounds were aired, cleaned, and checked by fellow crewmates. Meals were cooked safely on solid ground, away from the spray of salt. Food stores were rotated before moisture could turn them sour. Men relieved themselves properly, away from the cramped space of the ship. Bedding was shaken out to free it from salt, sand, or unwelcome insects. Lard or tallow was rubbed onto skin raw from salt rash. And from every seam of every garment, lice were scraped away. None of this appears in the sagas. No poet bothered to immortalize the simple, necessary rituals of staying alive. But these routines lived in muscle memory passed from one generation of seafarers to the next. Learned through storms, cold nights, and the consequences of ignoring them. And here lies the deeper truth. Their landings were guided not by maps, but by biology. They stopped before food turned dangerous, before damp wool bred mold, before small sores became septic. before exhaustion dulled judgment enough to become fatal. This rhythm, this invisible heartbeat, became one of the most effective disease prevention systems in maritime history. Yet even this cadence of land and sea cannot fully explain why Viking ships avoided the outbreaks that devastated so many navies. Because another layer remained, one shaped not by when they landed, but by how they lived together aboard the open vessel itself. Life aboard a Viking ship left no room for secrets. No corners to slip into. No walls to hide behind. Every action, every moment of weakness, every mistake, every lapse in judgment unfolded in full view of the entire crew. And that brutal transparency forged a discipline almost unheard of in medieval life. They checked each other for wounds, scanning skin and limbs for anything that might fester in the cold. They rotated sleep with precise timing, knowing that too many exhausted men could doom them all. They groomed daily even when wind sliced across the deck like a knife, because hygiene was not vanity, but survival. They shared the endless burden of bailing water, passing buckets hand to hand in a rhythm that never stopped. They monitored the strength and breathing of rowers. They managed fatigue as a collective, not as individuals. Among all these tasks, bailing stood above the rest. It was life or death in its purest form. Stop for too long, even for a moment, and seawater would rise faster than the ship could shed it. Hesitation meant drowning. Distraction meant catastrophe. So the entire crew moved as a single organism, synchronized not by command, but by necessity. Every man was part of a human engine. Each motion tied to the survival of everyone else aboard. This order, this relentless shared discipline, prevented the kinds of neglect that allowed infections to spread or injuries to worsen on other ships. On a longship, problems couldn't hide any more than the men themselves could. If something looked wrong, it was addressed. If someone faltered, the crew compensated. Yet even this human precision, this social armor, still isn't the final key. Because the greatest secret of Viking sanitation wasn't how the men behaved, but the very structure they lived, upon ancient, elegant, and hiding in plain sight. Remember that archaeological silence? The missing toilets? The absence of waste pits, barrels, or designated corners? The expectation that some kind of sanitation system had to be hidden somewhere? That silence wasn't a dead end. It was the clue. A Viking longship didn't require any sanitation structure because the ship itself, a masterpiece of minimalism, made one unnecessary. It wasn't enclosed. So air moved freely from bow to stern, stripping away humidity before it could feed bacteria. It didn't trap heat. So nothing ever stayed warm, damp, and dark long enough for rot to take hold. It didn't create shadows beneath decks because there was no deck. No darkness for disease to hide in. Everything breathed. The hull flexed with the swell of the sea. The gaps between planks inhaled and exhaled as waves rolled beneath them. Salt water rinsed the floors. Wind dried the wood. The crew's constant movement stirred the air like a bellows. Where medieval ships acted like sealed boxes capturing sweat, filth, and stagnant water, the Viking longship behaved like a living organism. Most navies tried desperately to keep the ocean out. The Vikings did the unthinkable. They let the ocean in just enough to clean. Never enough to sink. No device. No invention. No hidden latrine waiting to be unearthed. Instead, sanitation emerged from the elegant intersection of environment, engineering, biology, and human discipline. It was a system not added to the ship, but woven into its very existence. Yet even this revelation, as surprising as it is, does not close the mystery. Because one more secret remains, a truth subtle enough to hide in plain sight, but powerful enough to tie every single piece together in a final, unexpected way. Here is the truth that finally solves the mystery. The truth hiding in plain sight the entire time. The Viking longship was the sanitation system. Its openness created constant airflow, sweeping away humidity before pathogens ever had a chance to grow. Its flexible, clinker-built hull allowed seawater to rinse the interior in gentle, perpetual waves. Its materials, oak-rich in tannins, tar with natural antimicrobial oils, wool and animal fibers packed between the planks, formed a silent chemical defense against mold and bacteria. Its voyage rhythm, shaped by frequent landings, reset the crew's biology over and over. Its fermented drinks protected them from the waterborne diseases that devastated fleets for centuries. Its strict social discipline kept small wounds, infections, and exhaustion from spiraling into disaster. The Longship didn't simply survive nature. It worked with nature. Instead of sealing the world out, the Vikings opened their vessel to the sea. Just enough to clean, cool, dry, and renew itself, never enough to drown. Where other navies relied on enclosed decks that trapped filth and heat, Viking ships embraced the elements. Wind became their ventilation system. Waves became their rinse cycle. Cold became their sterilizer. The crew themselves became the engine that kept chaos in check. The secret archaeologists searched for wasn't a missing tool or forgotten invention. It wasn't a latrine buried under centuries of soil. It wasn't an engineered structure waiting to be discovered. It was woven into the wood. The gaps between planks, the open ribs, the breathable frame, the flexible skeleton of the vessel. All the details a modern shipbuilder might correct were exactly the features that kept Viking crews alive. This is the final piece of the puzzle. A longship was not merely built. It was alive, a living organism shaped by sea, wind, craftsmanship, and human instinct. And that living organism carried its people safely across one of the harshest oceans on Earth. When we look back at ancient civilizations, we often expect brilliance to appear in the form of machines, mechanisms, or lost technologies. But the deepest wisdom isn't always complicated. Sometimes, it lives in the quiet elegance of simple things done with absolute understanding. The Vikings didn't conquer the North Atlantic because they built more advanced tools. They survived because they listened to the sea, to the wind, to the cold. They shaped their world by aligning with nature rather than resisting it. And if this journey stirred something in you, if it made you wonder how people with nothing but wood, rope, muscle, and instinct crafted solutions that still astonish us today, then you're already walking the path we explore here. A path where the past still whispers through water and timber, where forgotten worlds rise again in the mind's eye, where ancient intelligence reveals itself not in complexity, but in harmony. This is the heart of Primal heritage, a place where we uncover the lessons our ancestors left behind and rediscover the wisdom modern life has buried. If you want more stories like this, stories where survival, simplicity, and human ingenuity come together in ways we rarely expect, stay with us. There is so much more waiting beyond the horizon, because sometimes the simplest designs hold the deepest wisdom.